Nike Air Zoom Tempo Next Percent. Have you heard the concept that less is more? Well, this shoe certainly doesn't follow it. And in my mind, it doesn't work. Trying to do more is more. So this shoe is supposed to be the replacement for the Alpha Fly, the training companion that replaces essentially the Pegasus and the Zoom Fly. Now, the previous generation of the Zoom Fly, such as the Zoom Fly Flyknit and the original Zoom Fly, which was the companion to the 4%, in my mind, are very much minimal shoes. Now, when we're talking minimal, we're not talking about the barefoot cushioning movement, such as things like this, the Scorer shoe I designed years ago, but rather more from a minimal design perspective in terms of having as little parts as possible. Things like the Nike Free, perhaps like this, or even previous versions of the Presto or the Huarache. The concept being that you have as little components between your foot and the road and as much integrated as possible. So these shoes all have a few things in common. They typically have an outsole that is also a midsole, trying to combine as many functions as you have there between cushioning and also grip. Also, of course, decorative elements, stuff like that. And then you have an upper that, again, is as little as possible and typically is relatively seamless. You might have a sock fit, you might have integrated lacing, you might have a knit upper with very little heel counter reinforcement and not a lot going on the upper itself. Now, the Zoom Fly Flyknit, you can see obviously is by that kind of ethos. It's a knit upper, hence the name Flyknit, has hardly any heel counter, has integrated lacing, a sock fit, and even in terms of the decoration, there's very little going on. You have very thin hot melt swooshes on both the medial and lateral side and a little bit of a heel pull tab to cover the seam in the knit. The previous generation of the Zoom Fly, which is the first generation, also used the technology that was available at the time to have a more minimal kind of approach. In this case, using an engineered type knit. So again, there's not a lot of overlays going on. And even though this shoe is a lot more in terms of stiffer than the than the following shoe, the Zoom Fly, it has a much stiffer heel counter and has a more traditional kind of collar lining. Doesn't have the sock fit, so has a more traditional tongue. It's still very much minimal, especially from an upper perspective. Again, not talking about cushioning. Both of these shoes have a plate inside, are very stiff, and obviously have a lot of cushioning in the midsole. Now, when we're looking at the new shoe, the Tempo Next Percent, there's even more going on. So aside from the upper itself, which we'll get into, let's look at the midsole and outsole. So the previous ones, as mentioned, have essentially very few components. There's essentially a rubber a rubber forefoot. You have a couple of pods at the heel, and then you have your main cushioning midsole here. You have a carbon fiber plate. And then you have a top-loaded element of foam as well that covers that plate. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4 different parts. The Tempo Next Percent, however, has almost twice as many parts. So looking at it from the bottom, you also, of course, have the rubber components, quite a bit heavier. I would also kind of like to note, you have some heel pods for rubber grip. And then looking at the forefoot, you have some of the key signature elements. You have obviously your Zoom Fly airbags in the forefoot, and you have your Zoom X foam ahead of that. And then an additional component of Zoom X foam in the heel, with additional React foam then around that, providing the main cushioning element. On top of that, you then have your carbon fiber plate in your Alpha Fly, or in this case, you have a glass reinforced nylon plate, I understand. And then you have more foam that's top loaded on top of that even. So how many different components do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 components for the midsole and outsole. And this, I think, is where the problem is. This shoe I found in terms of a running performance and feel to be a lot slower than any previous generations, a lot less responsive, and probably one of the loudest shoes I've ever worn. It sounded like I was wearing rubber boots while running. And part of this comes down to the construction and this kind of more is more type approach. This shoe has a very stiff plate that is not only stiff from toe to heel, but also is very stiff from medial to lateral. And that's because of these Zoom airbags. You have to have a stiff plate so that these Zoom airbags are responsive and they don't pop, and you also don't get delamination between the different components. What this does is when you're essentially having a running motion that is a toe off that is moving not only from toe to heel, but also from side to side, you have very much a slapping motion on the ground. And that's what this feels like, and that's what this sounds like when you're running down the road. It feels very much like this. So in my mind, this shoe doesn't work. The upper as well, if we take a look at it, has a lot more happening than the previous generation. Whereas the upper of the Zoom Fly knit, as mentioned, is essentially just kind of one piece knit. You have a knit upper on this shoe. They're calling it Atom knit, and it is a sock fit. But you also have a lot more reinforcement. The previous generation shoes had a little bit of reinforcement around the eye stay. This shoe actually has almost a complete arch band going around in terms of supporting the quarter because of the very light upper materials. You also have a hot melt toe cap reinforcement. And you have, like the previous generation, a different style of heel counter, combining your collar lining and collar foam padding in the back. So all told, this shoe is definitely, I would say, not as comfortable. The fit is not as good. That's also owing to the die-cut insole that you have here compared to the anatomical molded insole that you have in the previous generation. And just overall, I find there's just too much kind of going on, and you don't get that very responsive feel. So for me, I definitely will stick with the fly knits. This shoe is definitely interesting from a design perspective and how they've kind of managed to incorporate all these different features and functions and have a takedown approach to the Alpha Fly that you could say feels very similar to the Alpha Fly and not in only good ways. But I definitely prefer a less is more kind of approach.